Hey everyone, in this geometrynodes tutorial, let's learn how to make this cool glowing tunnel motion design. It will be completely procedural and seamlessly looping. Let's dive in. Alright, so with our default cube selected, let's jump into the geometrynodes tab up top and click new. So as always, we'll delete the group input with X, and we're going to start off by making a ring. And to do that, we'll pull in a circle curve, or a curved circle. And we can Alt-Shift left click that to connect it to the group output. Now we can see it here in the middle. Let's set the radius to, let's say maybe 10 meters. And depending on the size of this radius, the bigger this radius, the faster the animation will be. So the smaller the radius, the slower the animation will be. For now, we'll start with 10. And right away, I want to actually change this into a mesh. So bring in a curve to mesh. And then with a profile curve, we'll pull in another circle curve. And now we can see this ring here. And let's actually set up the camera. So let's click the camera here, hold Alt-R, Alt-G to move it to the center. And then let's say rotate 90 degrees on X. And actually rotate 90 degrees on Z as well. And let's pull that down on the Y-axis to the middle of this ring. So now if we go into the view camera, you can see how we're inside this ring. I'm going to back that off just a little bit so that we can see the side of the tunnel. Let's click the ring there and let's pin the geometry node setup so we don't lose that again. So from here, there's two things we want to do. We want to branch off and create a geometry stream that has the random stars, and then do another geometry stream that has the grid tunnel effect. So maybe let's start with that. Let's pull this mesh output into a delete geometry, and we'll select the faces. We want to get rid of the faces and just have like a wireframe of this tunnel. And we'll do only faces here. And if we look at the output there by holding Control-Shift, click, now you can see we have this wireframe. There's no geometry to that yet, so we'll add that in a minute. But for now, let's change the resolution of our initial curve. And I'm looking for a good density, but also this square. I want this to be more square, and so we can change the resolution of the curve circle at the bottom plus the top, and just kind of tweaking that until it's kind of a square shape. I think that looks pretty good. All right, let's get rid of the viewer node. Now what we need to do is convert this from, let's see, it's a mesh right now, so we'll convert it from mesh to a curve again. And then that lets us do a curve to mesh so that we can do another profile curve with a circle. Lots of curved circles here. And we'll Alt-Shift click this to connect that to the output. The radius of this is way too high, so we will, I don't know, maybe punch it in actually 0.001 or maybe 0.002. And the resolution I think can be quite low because this is just going to be a glowing mesh. So we'll leave it at 4. Okay, so now let's start to distribute the points within this so that we get the stars that fly by. So from this curve to mesh, let's pull that mesh output out to a mesh to volume. So we'll take that same ring and we'll convert that into a volume, which you can look at. Let's see, zoom out here. So now it's kind of cloud, looks like a cloud. Again, we have the different geometry down here. That's our mesh down there, but now we're going to create this volume shape. Because when we do that, we can Shift A to distribute points in volume. So now we get all these different points here. We can change the density. We can always tweak that depending on how the animation looks. For now, I'm just going to change it up to maybe a 6. And then on those points, we'll instantiate an icosphere. So we'll pull out this instance, type in icosphere, icosphere mesh, subdivisions. You can give it a couple subdivisions. And the radius, for now, it doesn't matter. We can say 0.1. But what we'll actually do is we'll randomize this. But before we do that, let's go and bring in a join geometry node. And we'll just connect these two geometry streams together so that we get our ring with the points inside. And if we press tilde and go into view camera, now we can see these points throughout the ring. But let's give this a random shape. To do that, I'm just going to pull in a random value. And I'm just going to leave this at float because we can use that value here into the scale. And we'll change the min, yeah, maybe like 0.1 min and a max of, let's say, yeah, I like that 0.6. I'm actually going to change the seed here. That's the starting frame. I like that as a starting frame better than the initial frame that we had with seed 0. So now what we need to do, if we go to the top of this layout, we see the camera here. What we need to do is spin this ring and the stars in place so we can kind of preview what this looks like. If we take the transform geometry, which we're not going to use, this is just to demonstrate what's going to happen. But if we spin this on the Z, what should happen is the ring moves towards the camera. So it looks like the camera's actually moving, but really it's just the ring spinning around. So if we go into the view camera and do that again, there you go. That's what our movement looks like. And I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. Those are a little bit tall. So again, I'm just going to fiddle with these numbers until I like them. Just stretch those out. That's probably better. Super picky, but okay, so now if we go back, we looked at this transform geometry, but we don't want to use that. We'll Alt, or let's see, we'll Command X to cut that but not break the connection. And instead, we'll bring in a set position. And this lets us offset the geometry, but we're actually going to calculate the position of everything while we spin it around using a vector rotate. And the vector that we want to spin is the initial position, the position that's at, and plug that into position. So now if we spin this angle, you can see that the ring itself spins around, the ring and the stars. So let's drive that based on the animation time. So Shift A to pull in the scene time. We've got the frame here. So if we take the frame and divide it by the number of frames that we have set here, which I usually change a lot. So I'll right click that and copy as a new driver, and then right click this bottom value and paste that driver. So now if I ever change this value down here, you can see that it changes that purple value as well. And I'm going to set this to 500 for now. I think this might be kind of fast, but we'll see. So if we have frame 1 out of 500, it's not very complete, but if we're at frame 500 out of 500, it's 100% complete. So that is the factor that we'll use to drive a multiply node here. So factor 0 to 1 times tau, which is 360 degrees. And that's the angle that we want, 360 degrees. So in 500 frames, this whole ring is going to spin 360 degrees. So right now it looks not too bad. Maybe a little fast. We can slow it down. We can say maybe 700. And it's a little bit slower that way. Okay, so now with our setup, let's start adding some materials here. We've got 2 geometry lines coming in here. So let's Shift A, bring in a set material, Shift D to duplicate that and put it on the bottom geometry. The top is the we'll call them stars, and I'll just highlight all of these and Shift P, I think, yeah, as a frame around it, F2, and call it stars, just for a little bit of readability. Then the bottom, same thing, Shift P, F2, and we'll call it wireframe. And these guys down here, Shift P, F2, rotation. And these two, last but not least, F2, call them rings. Those are rings. Okay, so that's a lot more readable. It's broken up into readable sections there. Okay, so let's go into the shading tab up top and jump into the view camera. Let's go into the drop down up here and say world opacity off. Let's use the scene lights and the scene world, which reminds me we don't need this light at all. So we can delete that with X. The scene world has a strength of 1 and it's gray. Let's turn that all the way down, just black. Actually undo that because we need to click the object first. And let's give this, let's call this wireframe. And because we're going to jump back into geometry nodes to set materials to these materials, let's add an additional material right away, which we'll call stars. Okay, so let's jump back really quick to geometry nodes. And this is the stars. So we'll set material to the stars. And over here, we'll set material to the wireframe. Okay. So now let's go into shading and jump back to the wireframe. And this is just going to be a simple emission. And I'll copy the hex value here. With a strength of maybe 12. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Purple's my favorite color. Absolutely love purple. So now with that set, let's also bring in the stars material here. And this will be a little bit more involved, but really not too bad. What I want to do is for every star, I want to give it a random color using this object info's random output. So for that, we can bring in a color ramp. And I'm going to give it 3 stops. So 1, 2, 3, and then clicking this drop down, we can distribute the stops evenly from left, I believe is what we want. That separates it, splits it exactly into 3. 0%, 33%, 66%. And so for those colors, I'm just going to copy the hex codes as well. We'll click the black here, click this color, and in the hex, paste that in. Second stop, click that arrow, click the color, and paste in the hex code again. And finally for this last stop, click the stop itself, click the color, and paste in the final hex code. Now right now it's set to linear. We can set that to constant. A shade might actually be spline, or yeah, linear might look kind of nice. That might look kind of nice. We'll go with that for now. So plug in the random to the factor, and the random I believe outputs a value from 0 to 1 as decimal values. And then the color we'll put into this emission down here. Color, and the emission will say 12. So that's a good start. What we're missing here is the compositor. We need to get that glare in. So let's go to the corner and let's split this window. Go up here to this drop down and bring in the compositor. Zoom in on this window here. And in the compositor window, press N and click Use Nodes. Let's zoom in and Shift A to add a glare node. Drop that down, but let's change streaks to, let's try fog glow, high quality. And then we need to also say in this drop down in the very far right, compositor is always there. Okay, so after tweaking the size a little bit, just to get a little less glow in there, I think this might be a little too dense as well. But let's turn the world strength down to 0. It's looking a little bit better. I think that the wireframe might be too... Oh, that's a bit better. Yeah, so now there's a bit of glow around that, whereas before, what was it at, 12? Yeah, there's not much at all. So maybe even 20, 30, something like that. We can always tweak these to our liking. I think it is a little too dense. Yeah, let's go back to the geometry nodes. Let's change that density in the distributed points in volume to maybe a 4, 3. That looks pretty nice. I can see this is set to 24 frames per second, so let's go change that in the layer or in the output tab and change that to 30 FPS. So that looks pretty good. Let's go back into shading. Now looking at the shading, I don't want to see too much of this wireframe in the background. So what we can do is we can go to the world settings and go into the volume, and we can add a principal volume. And the volume is really dense, like the fog is really dense. So if we drop that down to maybe a 0.4, we start to lose the background a bit more. we also start to lose some of that bloom on the stars. So let's just play around with that a bit. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe if we increase the size, we'd get some of that light back. That's not too bad. Okay. In the camera setting, let's select the camera, click the camera tab. Let's go to viewport display, passport 2. Let's set that to 0.99. I think I like how that looks. You can see up top that we're dropping frames. It's red, which means our target is 30 frames per second. We're hitting about 25. So we can actually fix that by going into the geometry node setup, Shift A and hit bake, and Shift left arrow to go back to the first frame. And I think if we bake that frame and then play, now we're hitting our 30 FPS. There is a trick with that though, that if you were to change some of the geometry, you'll have to delete the bake and bake it again. For instance, if I change this resolution, you can see in the viewport that it's not actually changing. That's because it's using the baked information. So just a little gotcha to be aware of. Okay, so this is coming along really well. All right, so last thing, let's add a little bit to this compositor just to give it a little bit more pop. And what we can do for that is Shift A to bring in a mask, and an ellipse mask especially. So using this glare's color output, we'll bring in a mix color. That'll go into the first input, and then this mask is going to go into the bottom input. And we want the mask to multiply on top there. So now if you look at only the bottom, you can see the mask here. And with that in focus, we can start to tweak the width and the height of this ellipse just to give it a bit of, it's not depth of field, but it's, oh, that's a good idea. We can maybe try depth of field too. But we're going to give it a bit of a vignette. So we can try that. And let's Shift A to bring in blur, a Gaussian blur. And that'll blur these edges so that they're not so sharp. Right now it's also a factor of 1, so we can dial that back a bit too, so that it's not pure black on these edges. But we can start to blur that X and the Y. That looks pretty cool. And then dial this factor back a bit so that it's not pure black in the corners. But maybe I'll try, yeah, I'm gonna try reducing the width of that mask a bit more too. Perfect. And last thing you can do maybe after this glare is bring in a hue saturation value node. And you can always look around. You can always just kind of tweak this just a little bit, holding Shift as you move these sliders, just to get a better, just to see if you can make anything pop or improve, or even shift the hue entirely, which I'm not going to do. But I decided too that these orbs, the stars, are too big, so I'm actually going to change the min or the max down. Oh, my bad. See, I got to delete the bake here and then change this max down. I think that's a bit better. And then we'll bake it again. All right, one last thing we can do before we render is let's go back to frame 1 by pressing Shift left arrow. And then you can press Shift right arrow to go to the very end frame. Down here you can see it's 500. But because this is a loop, we want it to be a perfect loop, frame 501, if you press the right arrow again to go to frame 501, 501 and frame 1 should be exactly the same. So we can jump back from this frame to frame 1 by pressing Shift left. And as you do that, keep an eye on the viewport to make sure that nothing changes. And that's how I like to make sure that this is a perfectly looping animation, which it is. So we're ready to render this now. If we go into the render tab, we can look at the color management. We can go to the look, and maybe punchy might be better. No, not quite. High contrast. I kind of like the look of that. Turn on motion blur, turn on ray tracing, and then let's go to the output. It's at 30 frames per second. Change this to FFmpeg video. And then the encoding drop down, let's go to MPEG 4, H.264 codec with perceptually lossless. I think that's the highest you can do with MPEG 4. If you set it to lossless, it doesn't work properly. Has been my experience. Encoding speed good, no audio, that's it. And with that set up, you can go into render and render animation. And here's the final result. How did yours turn out? Let me know in the comments what you learned or enjoyed about the tutorial. Be sure to subscribe and check out this tutorial to continue your geometry nodes journey.